The winter wind howled against the ancient stones of Ashford Manor like a mourner at a funeral, and perhaps that was fitting, for something precious was dying within those gilded walls on this January evening in 1825. The great hall blazed with 1,000 candles, their light reflecting off crystal and silver, transforming the Duke's ancestral seat into something from a fairy tale. Yet Lady Arabella Thornfield felt only cold as she stood beside her new husband in the receiving line, her hand resting lightly upon his arm, though he might have been carved from marble for all the warmth he offered. She was 19, small and delicate, with dark hair arranged in careful curls, her wedding gown of ivory silk, chosen by the Duke's staff since she had no mother to guide such choices, and as guest after guest offered congratulations with smiles that never quite reached their eyes, she wondered if everyone could see what she already knew in her heart, that the Duke of Ashford had not married her for love. Adrian Blackwell, 6th Duke of Ashford, stood rigid beside her, a man of 30 whose reputation preceded him like winter before the snow, known throughout England for his ruthless business dealings, his cold dismissal of fortune hunters, and the ice that seemed to flow through his veins, where warmer men had blood. He was handsome in the severe way of classical statues, with dark hair and darker eyes, a jaw that might have been chiseled from granite, and during the ceremony he had spoken his vows in a voice devoid of feeling, as though he were reading items from a ledger rather than binding his life to hers. Arabella had tried to catch his eye throughout the wedding breakfast, hoping for some small sign of tenderness or even acknowledgement, but he had looked through her as though she were made of glass, transparent and inconsequential, and now, as the last guests departed into the snowy night, she felt her courage faltering as a footman led her to the Duchess's chambers. She had been prepared for shyness, for awkwardness, even for disappointment, but she had not been prepared for the cold fury in her husband's eyes when he entered her chamber an hour later, still in his wedding clothes, his expression thunderous. "Did you think I would not discover the truth?" he demanded, and his voice was like frost creeping across a window pane. Arabella stood from where she had been sitting by the fire, her hands trembling. "Your Grace, I do not understand. Your father," he interrupted, advancing toward her with barely controlled rage, "died owing debts across half of England. He was a gambler, a wastrel, a man who traded on his ancient name while his creditors circled like vultures. And you, madam, saw in me nothing but the fortune that might restore your family's name." The accusation struck her like a physical blow, and she felt tears burning her eyes, though she refused to let them fall. "That is not true," she whispered. "I agreed to this marriage because my guardian believed it a good match, because I hoped that we might find companionship, perhaps even love." The word dripped with contempt. "How convenient that your tender feelings bloomed only after you learned the extent of my wealth." He turned away from her, his hands clenched at his sides. "I will not be used as your father used others, married for my coffers by a woman who sees me as nothing but a means to an end. You will leave Ashford Manor tonight." The world seemed to tilt beneath Arabella's feet. "Leave? But we are married, I am your wife." "You are a mistake," he said, each word precise and cutting, "and I will not compound it by keeping you under my roof. There is a cottage on the far edge of my lands, isolated and small. You will reside there on an allowance sufficient for basic needs, and you will tell no one of the circumstances of your exile. The world will believe you prefer the country to society, that you are delicate and require solitude." He finally turned to face her, and his eyes were empty of everything but certainty. "Do not think to plead or to convince me otherwise. My decision is final." And so, less than 6 hours after speaking vows that promised honor and cherishing, Arabella found herself in a carriage rattling through the darkness, a single maid weeping beside her, bound for a cottage she had never seen, banished by a husband who had judged her without trial and found her guilty of sins she had never committed. And as the lights of Ashford Manor disappeared behind them, swallowed by winter and night, she understood that her dreams of marriage had died before they ever truly lived, and she was being sent to bury them alone in the cold and unforgiving dark. But before our lover's fate is revealed, subscribe so you never miss a chapter of romance and scandal, and tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? Now, let's begin. 3 months had passed since that terrible night, and spring was beginning to touch the edges of the world, though it had not yet reached Arabella's heart as she knelt in the small garden behind the cottage, her hands deep in the dark earth, coaxing life from soil that seemed as reluctant as she to believe in new beginnings. The cottage was indeed small, just 4 rooms with low ceilings and walls that had once been whitewashed, but had faded to the color of old bone, situated at the very edge of the Duke's lands, where the manicured forests gave way to wild moorland. And in those first terrible weeks she had wept until she had no tears left, had raged at the injustice until her voice grew hoarse. But eventually the storm of her emotions had subsided into something quieter and more dangerous. A cold, wounded dignity that wrapped around her heart like armor. She had learned to manage on the meager allowance that arrived each month through the stern-faced solicitor, who never met her eyes, had learned to mend her own clothes when they tore, to prepare simple meals from the supplies that Mrs. Hewitt brought each week, to find occupation in the hours that stretched endlessly before her like an unforgiving road. Mrs. Hewitt was perhaps 60, with silver hair tucked beneath a neat cap and eyes that held more kindness than pity, and though she never spoke directly about the circumstances of Arabella's exile, her gentle presence became the only human warmth in days that might otherwise have frozen Arabella's spirit entirely. The elderly housekeeper brought not just bread and cheese and candles, but also books borrowed from some mysterious source, seeds for the garden, news from the village that lay 2 miles distant, and once, a letter from Arabella's former governess that had somehow found its way through channels Arabella dared not question. She spent her days reading philosophy and poetry, tending the garden that was slowly, grudgingly yielding to her determination, walking the moorland paths where the wind sang songs of freedom and loneliness in equal measure, and in the evenings she would sit by the fire and wonder what she had done to deserve such punishment, though she knew the answer. She had been born to the wrong father, had carried the stain of his mistakes upon her skin like an invisible mark that the Duke had seen and judged her by. In the village, she knew there were whispers about the banished Duchess, theories traded over market stalls, and in the dim corners of the public house, some saying she was mad, others that she had committed some unforgivable indiscretion, and a few charitable souls suggesting that perhaps the Duke himself was the one at fault. Though such words were spoken softly for fear of his retribution, Arabella heard these whispers on her rare visits to purchase thread or lamp oil, saw the curious glances and the quickly averted eyes, felt the weight of speculation and judgment, yet she held her head high and spoke with courtesy to all she met, for she would not give the Duke or anyone else the satisfaction of seeing her broken. She would not write begging letters or plead for mercy, would not humiliate herself by throwing herself upon his non-existent compassion, for she had been raised to believe that dignity was the one possession that could never be taken from a person unless they surrendered it willingly. And this she refused to do, so she survived in her exile with quiet grace, tending her garden and her wounded heart, waiting for nothing because she had learned that hope was a luxury she could no longer afford. While Arabella learned the bitter lessons of exile in her cottage on the moors, Adrian Blackwell paced the halls of Ashford Manor like a ghost haunting the scene of his own crime, unable to sleep for more than a few hours each night, tormented by dreams that left him gasping in the darkness, reaching for something he could not name. The great house felt emptier than it ever had, though he had lived much of his life in solitude, preferring the company of ledgers and correspondence to the falseness of society. Yet now the silence pressed against him like a physical weight, and he found himself avoiding the Duchess's chambers entirely, for he could not bear to see the room prepared for a bride who had spent mere hours within those walls before he had cast her out into the night. His butler, Thornbury, a man of perhaps 60 who had served the Blackwell family since Adrian was a boy, moved through the manor with an air of quiet disapproval that never manifested in words, but was nonetheless palpable in the precise way he arranged the morning papers. The careful neutrality of his expression when Adrian asked after household matters, and once, when Adrian had mentioned something about the cottage's supplies, Thornbury had permitted himself the smallest comment. "Her Grace bears her circumstances with remarkable dignity, Your Grace," a statement that landed like an accusation, though it was delivered in the same tone one might use to discuss the weather. Adrian told himself that he had been right to send her away, that he had protected himself from the fate that had destroyed his father, for his mother had been beautiful and charming and entirely mercenary, marrying the 5th Duke of Ashford for his title and wealth when she was barely 18. and Adrian's earliest memories were of watching her spend his father's money on jewels and gowns and eventually on a lover, an Italian count who had swept her away to the continent when Adrian was 7, leaving behind a husband who never recovered from the betrayal and a son who learned that love was simply another word for transaction. His father had died when Adrian was 15, broken by grief and humiliation, and Adrian had inherited not just the title and estates but also a certainty that ran bone deep, and that women of gentle birth who married into wealth did so for calculated reasons, that affection could be performed as easily as any theatrical role, and that he would never be such a fool as his father had been, and would never permit his heart to be used as currency in someone else's scheme. Yet even as he rehearsed these justifications, he found himself requesting reports from Mrs. Hewitt about his wife's conduct, ostensibly to ensure she was managing adequately, but in truth, because he could not stop wondering about the woman he had banished, could not forget the stricken look on her face when he had pronounced his judgment, the way her hands had trembled as she tried to speak, the tears she had refused to let fall even as her world collapsed around her. And Mrs. Hewitt's reports painted a picture that troubled him. Lady Arabella was kind to all she encountered, grateful for the smallest mercies, never complained about her reduced circumstances, spent her days in useful occupation rather than sulking or scheming, and displayed none of the grasping entitlement he had expected from a fortune hunter. He told himself that this was merely a performance, that she was biding her time and planning some campaign to restore herself to his good graces and his wealth. Yet as the weeks became months and no such campaign materialized, no tearful letters arrived begging for forgiveness or reconciliation, he began to feel something he had not anticipated, doubt, cold and creeping, whispering that perhaps he had been wrong, that perhaps he had judged her by sins that belonged to another woman entirely, and this possibility haunted him more than any ghost ever could. 6 months had passed since that winter night of banishment, and summer had arrived with its warmth and long golden evenings, yet Adrian found no peace in the beauty of the season as he rode toward the village near Arabella's cottage, dressed not in the fine clothes befitting his station, but in the simple garments of a country gentleman, a dark coat and plain breeches that would allow him to move through the streets without drawing attention or recognition, for he had to see her, had to witness with his own eyes whether the reports of her character were truth or performance. He had told no one of his plan, had left Ashford Manor before dawn, with only his horse and his consuming need to understand the woman he had married, and then cast aside, and as he approached the village, he felt his heart beating in a rhythm that seemed to match his horse's hooves against the packed earth of the road. He found a place to observe from a distance, near the old stone church where he could see the main street without being obviously visible himself, and he had been there perhaps an hour, beginning to feel foolish for this strange espionage, when he saw her emerge from the chandler's shop carrying a basket, her dark hair caught up in a simple style, her dress a plain cotton that had clearly been mended more than once, yet she moved with such natural grace that she might have been wearing the finest silks of London, and the dignity would have been no more evident. Adrian watched as she paused to speak with an elderly woman who was struggling with a heavy bundle, watched as Arabella immediately set down her own basket and took the burden without hesitation, carrying it toward a small cottage at the edge of the village square, while the old woman followed with expressions of gratitude. And when they reached the cottage, Arabella did not simply leave the bundle at the door, but accepted an invitation inside, disappearing from his view for nearly 20 minutes. When she emerged, her basket was lighter than before, and Adrian understood with a twist of something in his chest that she had shared her own modest supplies with someone who had even less, an act of generosity from a woman who had been reduced to near poverty by his own decree, and he felt the first crack appear in the wall of certainty he had built around his judgment of her. He followed at a distance as she made her way toward the path that led to her cottage, intending only to observe and then return to the manor. But fate or fortune intervened when his horse, startled by a dog that ran suddenly across the road, reared and sent Adrian stumbling backward into Arabella's path just as she rounded a curve. "Oh!" she exclaimed, steadying herself with one hand against a tree, her eyes wide with surprise as she looked at him, and Adrian found himself staring into a face he had tried so hard to forget, seeing the delicate features that had haunted his dreams, the eyes that held no recognition because she had no reason to expect the Duke of Ashford to appear before her in such humble dress. "I beg your pardon," he managed, his voice rougher than intended, and she smiled, actually smiled, a small, gentle expression that nearly undid him. "No harm done, sir," she said with a kindness that made his throat tight. "Your horse seems spirited. Are you injured?" The genuine concern in her voice for a stranger, the natural courtesy she extended without calculation or expectation of reward, planted seeds of doubt so deep in Adrian's heart that he knew they would grow into something that might destroy the careful fortress he had built around his emotions. And as she wished him well and continued on her way, he stood rooted to the spot, watching her disappear down the path, more troubled than he had been before this expedition, and certain of only one thing, that nothing about this woman matched the assumptions he had made, and he would find no peace until he understood the truth. The encounter with his wife, brief though it was and unrecognized by her as it had been, left Adrian restless in a way that transcended his previous disquiet, and within days of returning to Ashford Manor, he found himself summoning his man of business, a discreet individual named Graves, who had served the Blackwell family for 2 decades and who possessed both the resources and the temperament to investigate matters that required delicacy. And though Graves's expression revealed nothing when Adrian requested a thorough examination of the late Lord Thornfield's affairs and his daughter's conduct prior to the marriage, Adrian sensed the man's curiosity about this sudden interest in a wife who had been banished half a year earlier. The investigation took 3 weeks, during which Adrian paced his study with an agitation that alarmed even the imperturbable Thornbury, unable to focus on estate business or correspondence, sleeping poorly and eating less, consumed by a growing dread that he had committed an injustice so profound that no amount of regret could remedy it. And when Graves finally returned with a folder of documents and interviews, Adrian's hands trembled slightly as he reached for them, a weakness he despised in himself, yet could not control. What he learned in the hours that followed shattered every assumption upon which he had built his condemnation of Arabella. For Lord Thornfield's debts, substantial though they were, had not been accumulated through gambling or dissipation, but rather through a pattern of extraordinary generosity, lending money to friends in distress that was never repaid, standing surety for a cousin's failed business venture, paying the medical expenses for tenants who could not afford treatment, and supporting a school for poor children in his district. And while such charitable impulses had indeed left him financially ruined at his death, they spoke to a character entirely opposite to the mercenary schemer Adrian had imagined. More devastating still was the discovery that Arabella, upon learning of her father's debts shortly after his passing, had quietly sold every piece of her mother's jewelry, save for one simple locket, pieces that had been meant as her dowry and her security, and had used the proceeds to pay as many of her father's creditors as possible, reducing the scandal and protecting his name even as she reduced herself to near poverty. And this act of filial devotion and financial sacrifice had occurred 3 months before Adrian's marriage proposal, meaning she had come to him with almost nothing, had accepted his offer knowing she brought no fortune to the union, yet had never mentioned her circumstances or attempted to use them to gain sympathy or advantage. Graves had also located Arabella's former governess, a Miss Pettigrew who now lived in Bath, and her testimony, recorded in careful script, painted a picture of a young woman raised with love and principle, taught to value kindness over consequence and integrity over advantage, a girl who had cared for her ailing father with devotion during his final months, and who had wept not for her lost prospects, but for his suffering and the ruin of his reputation. And Miss Pettigrew had concluded her statement with words that burned themselves into Adrian's memory. "Lady Arabella possesses the sort of goodness that cannot be feigned, Your Grace, for it proceeds not from calculation, but from a heart that has known love, and therefore knows how to give it." Adrian sat alone in his study as evening fell, the documents spread before him like accusations, and felt the full weight of his terrible mistake settle upon him with crushing force. Understanding now that he had taken a woman of genuine virtue and punished her for sins that existed only in his own wounded imagination, had projected his mother's betrayal onto an innocent girl who had done nothing but accept his offer of marriage with hope and perhaps even affection, and the realization brought him to his knees, literally kneeling on the floor of his study while tears he had not shed since childhood burned tracks down his face. Yet even in the midst of this devastating recognition, pride and fear still whispered their poison, for to acknowledge his error would require a vulnerability he had spent his entire adult life avoiding, would mean admitting that he had been wrong, that he had let old wounds dictate present cruelty, that he had perhaps destroyed something precious before it even had the chance to grow. And the prospect of facing Arabella with this truth, of seeing in her eyes the confirmation of what he had done, filled him with a terror more profound than any he had known. For several days he remained paralyzed between knowledge and action, understanding what he should do, yet unable to overcome the habits of self-protection that had governed him for so long, until finally he reached a compromise with himself, a plan that would allow him to observe her further, to be certain of her character beyond any doubt, before he revealed himself and his discoveries. For surely, his frightened heart insisted, surely it was wise to be absolutely certain before taking such an irrevocable step as confession and attempted reconciliation. And he told himself this was prudence rather than cowardice, though some part of him knew the truth. Autumn arrived with its particular melancholy beauty, painting the landscape in shades of amber and rust, and 9 months had passed since that winter night when Adrian had sent his bride into exile. 9 months, during which the seasons had turned and transformed the world, while Adrian himself remained caught in a strange suspension between knowledge and action, continuing his secret observations of Arabella even as his heart grew heavier with the weight of what he had learned and what he had done. She had created a life for herself in that small cottage, a life of modest contentment that would have been invisible to those who measured worth in grandeur. For 3 afternoons each week, the village children gathered in her tiny parlor, where she taught them to read, using books she had salvaged from her father's library, and others she borrowed from the vicar, and Adrian watched from concealment as these ragamuffin students arrived with eager faces and left with knowledge that might lift them beyond the circumstances of their birth, watched as Arabella's patience never wavered, even with the slowest learner. Watched as she somehow made each child feel that their progress mattered, that they mattered, and he understood that this generosity of spirit was not performance but essence, the fundamental nature of a woman who gave, because giving was as natural to her as breathing. The storm came on an evening in late September, one of those sudden violent tempests that arrive with little warning, and Adrian had taken shelter in the woods near the cottage when the wind began tearing at the trees with savage force, and through the driving rain he saw a section of the cottage roof lift and tear away, saw Arabella emerge into the deluge with remarkable composure to assess the damage, saw her immediately begin moving her precious books away from where rain now poured through the gap, working with efficient calm despite being soaked through. And there was something in her grace under crisis, in her practical response to disaster without hysteria or despair, that made Adrian's chest constrict with an emotion he could barely name. He wanted to rush to her aid, to use his resources and authority to fix what had broken, but he remained hidden like the coward he was beginning to recognize himself to be, and instead he rode through the storm back to Ashford Manor, and the next morning sent his best carpenter to the cottage with instructions to repair the roof, telling the man to say only that he had been passing and noticed the damage, and the carpenter, loyal and discreet, did as instructed. 2 days later a package arrived at the manor, brought by Mrs. Hewitt with an expression that suggested she knew more than she revealed, and inside Adrian found 6 jars of preserves made from the wild plums that grew near the cottage, their deep purple color rich as jewels, and tucked beneath them was a note in Arabella's careful script that read simply, "Kindness should never create obligation, but gratitude may be expressed nonetheless. Thank you for noticing what needed mending." Adrian sat with that note for an hour, reading and rereading those few words that contained such dignity and such implicit rebuke, for she had understood that the carpenter's appearance was no coincidence, had deduced that someone had sent help, and rather than demanding to know her benefactor's identity or creating obligation through effusive thanks, she had responded with grace and the offer of what little she had to give, and in that moment, something in Adrian's heart, some last barrier of self-protection, began to crack and crumble, and he knew that he was not merely attracted to this woman, or intrigued by her, or consumed with guilt over his treatment of her, but rather that he was falling, had perhaps already fallen, into a love so profound that it terrified him, for it was a love that demanded he become someone different, someone worthy, someone capable of the vulnerability and honesty that Arabella deserved, and he did not know if he possessed the courage for such transformation. The fever came upon Arabella with terrible swiftness in the first week of October, beginning as a slight chill that she attributed to the changing weather and progressing within 2 days to a burning illness that left her trembling and delirious. Unable to rise from her bed or keep down the broth that Mrs. Hewitt tried desperately to coax into her, and the elderly housekeeper, frightened by the rapid decline and knowing that the village doctor was away attending a difficult birth in the next county, and made a decision that she hoped would not be her undoing and sent urgent word to Ashford Manor that the Duchess was gravely ill and possibly dying. Adrian received the message while reviewing estate accounts in his study, and the carefully written words on the page before him became meaningless as his vision narrowed, and his heart began to race with a terror so profound it drove all other thoughts from his mind, and within minutes he was mounted and riding toward the cottage with a recklessness that alarmed his groom, pushing his horse through the autumn twilight as though he could outrun the possibility of loss, as though speed alone might keep death from claiming the woman he had only just begun to understand he loved. He burst through the cottage door without knocking, startling Mrs. Hewitt, who was placing cool cloths on Arabella's burning forehead, and the housekeeper stepped back with a knowing look as Adrian moved to the bedside, his usual composure shattered by the sight of his wife lying so pale and still, her dark hair matted with sweat and her breathing shallow and rapid, and he knelt beside the bed with hands that shook as he touched her face, feeling the terrible heat radiating from her skin. For 3 days and nights Adrian refused to leave her side, sleeping fitfully in the chair beside her bed when exhaustion overwhelmed him, bathing her fevered skin with cool water, holding her when the chills racked her body, and speaking to her constantly, even though he did not know if she could hear him, telling her things he had never said to anyone, confessing his regrets and his fears, and his desperate wish that she would live so that he might have the chance to love her properly. And Mrs. Hewitt watched this vigil with tears in her old eyes, seeing in the Duke's haggard face and trembling hands a devotion that spoke more powerfully than any declaration. In her delirium Arabella spoke as well, her voice faint and broken, words tumbling out without the guards that consciousness would have imposed, and Adrian learned in those fractured revelations what he had destroyed, for she spoke of her wedding day hopes, and of her nervousness, and her tentative joy at marrying a man she had heard was handsome and learned, even if he seemed stern, spoke of her hurt when he had looked at her with such coldness during the ceremony, of her confusion and devastation when he had banished her. And then, in a whisper that pierced Adrian to his core, she said, "I loved him even as he sent me away, loved him though he could not see me, loved him still though I knew I should not." And Adrian buried his face in the blankets beside her and wept with a grief and remorse so consuming that it felt as though his heart might break entirely, understanding in that moment the full measure of what his fear and pride had destroyed, the love that had been offered freely and rejected cruelly, and the future they might have had if he had possessed even a fraction of the courage and goodness that she embodied. Adrian maintained his vigil beside Arabella's bed with the fierce determination of a man who had finally found something worth fighting for, refusing to leave even when Mrs. Hewitt gently suggested he might rest in the other room, and on the second day the village doctor arrived, a gruff, elderly man named Dr. Morrison, who had attended births and deaths in these parts for 40 years, and who took in the scene before him with knowing eyes, observing the great Duke of Ashford unshaven and hollow-eyed, holding his wife's hand with a tenderness that seemed at odds with everything the doctor had heard about the man's coldness, and after examining Arabella and pronouncing that the fever had likely peaked and should break soon if God was merciful. "Doctor," Morrison remarked quietly that he had never seen devotion quite so profound, that whatever had transpired between Duke and Duchess before this moment seemed to matter far less than what he witnessed now, and Adrian merely nodded, unable to form words around the fear that still gripped his throat. On the third night the fever finally broke, and Arabella's skin cooled beneath Adrian's touch as her breathing deepened into true sleep, rather than the restless tossing of delirium. And Adrian, overwhelmed with relief and exhaustion, slumped in his chair and fell into the first genuine rest he had known in days, still holding her hand as though even in sleep he could not bear to let her go. When Arabella woke in the pale light of dawn, weak and confused, the first thing she saw was her husband, sleeping in the chair beside her bed, his head tilted at an uncomfortable angle and his hand clasping hers, and for a long moment she simply stared at him, trying to reconcile this haggard, unshaven man with the cold duke who had banished her, trying to understand what his presence here meant, and whether she possessed the strength to face whatever conversation must now occur. She withdrew her hand carefully, and the movement woke him immediately, and their eyes met in that quiet morning light, and Adrian saw in her gaze a wariness that cut him deeper than any anger could have done, for it spoke of trust broken so thoroughly that even his vigil through her illness could not immediately mend it. He began to speak then, haltingly and without the eloquence that usually came so naturally to him, telling her that he was sorry, that the words were inadequate, but they were all he had, that he had been wrong about her, wrong about everything, that his own fears and wounds had blinded him to the goodness that stood before him on their wedding night, and the confession spilled from him in broken phrases as he told her of his mother, of the beautiful woman who had married his father for a title and estate, and who had left when Adrian was 7 years old, abandoning her son without a backward glance to run away with a younger man of no fortune, and how that abandonment had taught him that women who married for position were incapable of true feeling, incapable of love, and how he had looked at Arabella on their wedding night and seen only his mother's beauty and his father's desperate hope, and had struck first before she could wound him as his mother had wounded his father. Arabella listened to this confession with an expression that remained carefully neutral, her hands folded on the coverlet, and when he finally fell silent, exhausted by the weight of words that had been locked inside him for so long, she spoke quietly, asking him if he had truly believed her capable of such calculated cruelty, if he had looked at her frightened face on their wedding night and seen deception rather than nervousness. And Adrian could only bow his head in shame and admit that yes, he had believed the worst because believing the worst had seemed safer than risking hope. They sat in silence for several minutes, and then Arabella, still weak from her illness but possessed of a dignity that sickness could not diminish, told him that she needed time, that his confession helped her understand, but did not erase the pain of these 9 months, that she had built a life in this cottage out of the ruins he had left her with, and she could not simply set that aside because he had finally chosen to see her clearly, and she asked him, with a gentleness that somehow made the request more devastating, to leave and give her space to think about what she wanted and whether forgiveness was even possible. Adrian felt the request like a physical blow, but he recognized that he had no right to demand anything from her, no right to expect that his suffering during her illness had earned him redemption, and so he nodded slowly and rose from the chair, his legs stiff from days of sitting, and before he left, he told her simply that he would respect her wishes, but that he would not disappear from her life again, that he would wait as long as necessary for her answer, and that she should know he loved her, had perhaps loved her from the first moment he saw her, though he had been too much a coward to acknowledge it. And then he left the cottage and stepped out into a morning that felt both impossibly bright and unutterably empty, knowing that he had finally spoken the truth, but uncertain whether truth alone could heal what his lies had broken. Adrian left the cottage that morning with Arabella's request for space echoing in his mind, but as he walked down the path toward where his horse waited, something within him rebelled against the idea of disappearing from her life again, even temporarily, for he had already abandoned her once, and that abandonment had been the greatest mistake of his existence. And though he would respect her need for time and distance, he could not bring himself to return to the cold emptiness of Ashford Manor and simply wait in comfort while she struggled alone with the decision of whether to forgive him. He stood beside his horse for several long minutes, one hand on the animal's neck, staring back at the cottage where the woman he loved was even now perhaps wondering if his departure meant another betrayal, and then, with a decision that felt both mad and utterly necessary, he removed the saddle from his horse and sent the animal back to the manor with a slap on its flank, and he walked back to Arabella's cottage and settled himself on the doorstep, wrapping his coat around himself against the October chill and preparing to wait for however long it took for her to believe that he would not leave her again. Mrs. Hewitt discovered him there when she arrived an hour later with fresh bread and soup for Arabella, and the elderly woman's eyes widened in shock at the sight of the Duke of Ashford sitting on the cold stone step like a common beggar. But Adrian met her gaze steadily and told her quietly that he would not abandon his wife again, that if she needed space, he would give it to her, but he would do so from her doorstep, where she could see him and know that he was constant in his devotion. And Mrs. Hewitt, who had watched Arabella suffer through 9 months of exile and had seen the Duke's anguish during her illness, merely nodded and stepped over him to enter the cottage, though she returned moments later with a blanket that she draped over his shoulders with a whispered encouragement that patience and persistence might yet mend what pride had broken. The village took notice of the Duke's presence within hours, for in a small community nothing remained secret for long, and soon there were whispers and stares and exclamations of disbelief that the great Adrian Blackwell, feared and powerful Duke of Ashford, had reduced himself to sleeping on his own wife's doorstep like a beggar seeking alms, and some said it was a fitting punishment for his cruelty, while others wondered if he had lost his mind entirely, but all agreed that they had never witnessed such a public display of penance from a man of his station. Arabella heard him settle on the step, heard the murmur of voices as Mrs. Hewitt spoke with him, and she stood frozen in her small parlour, torn between fury at his presumption and something that felt dangerously close to hope, for what man would humiliate himself so thoroughly unless his remorse was genuine? And yet she forced herself to ignore his presence, to go about her day as though the Duke of Ashford was not camped on her doorstep, because she needed to know if his persistence would outlast discomfort and public shame. For 3 days she stepped over him without acknowledgement when she needed to tend her garden or walk to the village, and Adrian never moved from his post except to step aside and allow her passage, and he endured the rain that fell on the second night and the cold wind that blew on the third day, and his fine clothes became rumpled and damp, and his face grew stubbled and worn. But still he remained, and his vulnerability became a spectacle that the entire village witnessed and discussed, some with derision, but many with a growing respect for a man who would strip away every shred of pride and dignity to prove his devotion to the wife he had wronged. On the 7th day of Adrian's vigil on her doorstep, Arabella woke to a morning that felt different somehow, as though the October air carried a softness that had been absent before, and when she rose and dressed and prepared her morning tea, she found herself preparing a second cup without quite deciding to do so, and she carried both cups to her door and opened it to find Adrian exactly where he had been for a week, huddled in the blanket. Mrs. Hewitt had brought him, his face drawn with cold and exhaustion, but his eyes immediately alert when the door opened, and Arabella said nothing, merely extended one of the cups toward him and watched as shock and gratitude flooded his features, and he took the tea with trembling hands that might have been shaking from cold or emotion or both, and she retreated inside before he could speak, closing the door gently behind her but feeling as though she had crossed some invisible threshold she had not quite meant to cross. The next day she brought him tea again, and this time she also brought a thicker blanket, one that had belonged to her father, and she left it folded beside him without meeting his eyes, and Adrian wrapped himself in it and held the fabric to his face for a moment, as though he could divine something of her heart from this wordless offering, and gradually, day by day, Arabella's gestures of mercy accumulated like autumn leaves drifting down one by one, until they formed something that might have resembled the earliest foundations of forgiveness. Adrian began to speak to her through the closed door in the evenings, his voice low and hesitant at first, telling her small things about his day, about the birds he had watched in her garden, about the way the sunset had painted the clouds, the color of rose petals, and then, when she did not tell him to stop, he began to share deeper things and memories of his childhood that he had never spoken aloud to anyone, stories of the small boy who had waited by the window for a mother who never returned, who had learned to lock away every soft feeling because softness had only ever led to abandonment, and he told her of the loneliness that had shaped him into the cold man who had sent her away, and of how watching her these past months had shown him that there were other ways to be, that strength could exist alongside gentleness, and that opening one's heart was not weakness, but the greatest courage of all. Arabella listened to these confessions from inside her cottage, standing pressed against the door with her own heart conflicted between the pain he had caused her and the growing certainty that his remorse was genuine, that this man sitting on her doorstep in the cold was not the same man who had banished her on their wedding night, and she found herself wanting to believe that people could change, that wounds could heal, that love might still be possible between two people who had begun so disastrously. On the 14th evening of his vigil, as the first frost touched the ground and Adrian's voice drifted through the door, telling her about his fear that he had destroyed something precious beyond repair. Arabella finally opened the door and looked down at him with an expression that held both wariness and something that might have been the beginnings of compassion, and she said quietly, with a slight tremor in her voice that betrayed how much the words cost her, "Come inside before you catch pneumonia, Your Grace." And Adrian looked up at her with such naked hope and gratitude that she had to look away, and he rose stiffly from the cold stone step and followed her into the warmth of the cottage, both of them knowing that this was not forgiveness, not yet, but it was a beginning, a small mercy that might lead to something more if they were both brave enough to try. Mrs. Hewitt arrived the next morning to find Adrian installed in the cottage's small spare room, a space that had served primarily for storage until Arabella had hastily cleared it the previous evening, and the elderly housekeeper's presence as chaperone lent a veneer of propriety to an arrangement that would otherwise have set the village tongues wagging even more furiously than they already were. Though in truth the awkwardness between husband and wife was such that no chaperone was truly necessary, for they moved around each other like strangers learning to share a confined space, overly polite and careful not to intrude upon each other's routines. They took their meals together at Arabella's small table, Adrian having insisted on helping prepare the food despite his obvious unfamiliarity with kitchen work, and these meals passed largely in silence, broken only by requests to pass the salt or observations about the weather. And yet the silence was not entirely uncomfortable, for it held a quality of patience rather than hostility, as though both of them understood that words would come when they were ready, and that forcing conversation would only build new walls between them. Gradually, over the course of days, small exchanges began to emerge, like green shoots pushing through winter soil, tentative and fragile but unmistakably alive, and Adrian would comment on a passage in whatever book lay open on the parlor table, and Arabella would respond with her own thoughts, and soon they discovered a shared love of philosophy and poetry that gave them safe ground upon which to build something that might eventually become friendship. Adrian occupied himself with repairs around the cottage, mending a loose hinge on the garden gate, replacing several cracked window panes, restacking the woodpile with a precision that spoke of his need to be useful, to prove through action what words alone could not convey. And Arabella watched these efforts with a careful neutrality that nonetheless softened incrementally. Each time she witnessed his genuine determination to contribute to her household, rather than simply command it, as a duke might command his own estate. There came an afternoon when they both reached for the same volume of Wordsworth that sat on a shelf between the kitchen and parlor, their hands meeting on the worn leather binding, and the touch sent a current of awareness through both of them that had nothing to do with the past and everything to do with the present moment, and with the man and woman they were now, rather than the strangers who had married in winter and destroyed each other before the marriage bed had even been warmed. And they both pulled away as though the book had burned them, but something shifted in that instant, some acknowledgement that there existed between them not just shared pain and the long road of reconciliation, but also the possibility of attraction, of desire, of all the things that might bloom between a husband and wife if given the chance to grow in soil that had been properly tended. The evening arrived cold and clear, with frost already beginning to form on the cottage windows, and after their modest supper had been cleared away and Mrs. Hewitt had retired to her small room off the kitchen, Arabella and Adrian found themselves drawn to the fireplace in the parlor, settling into the two chairs that flanked the hearth with a familiarity that would have seemed impossible only weeks before, and for a long while they sat in companionable silence, watching the flames dance and listening to the snap and hiss of burning wood, until finally Arabella spoke in a voice so quiet that Adrian had to lean forward to hear her properly, and she said, "I need to tell you something about that night, about our wedding night, because I think you should know what it meant to me, what I had hoped for, and what I lost." And Adrian nodded, in his throat too tight for speech, and so she continued, her words coming slowly at first and then faster, like water breaking through a dam. She told him that she had loved him from the moment she first saw him at the Havisham ball 6 months before their arranged marriage, that she had watched him from across the ballroom and thought him beautiful despite his cold demeanor, that when her uncle had informed her of the betrothal, she had been terrified, but also filled with a desperate hope that perhaps she might be the one to reach the lonely man she sensed beneath the ducal hauteur, and she described how she had spent the weeks before the wedding imagining their life together, dreaming like the foolish girl she had been of transforming Ashford Manor into a home filled with warmth and laughter and love. And when she spoke of standing in her wedding gown in that cold bedchamber, waiting for him with her heart full of hope, only to have him accuse her of mercenary motives and banish her like a criminal, her voice finally broke, and tears began to slip down her cheeks unchecked. Adrian made a sound like a wounded animal and dropped to his knees before her chair, his own face wet with tears that he did not bother to hide, and he took her hands in his and pressed them to his forehead, as though seeking absolution or benediction, or simply the comfort of her touch. And he said, his voice raw with emotion, "I am so sorry, Arabella. I am so profoundly sorry that words seem meaningless, and I know I can never undo what I did to you, never give you back that innocent hope I destroyed. But I need you to understand that my cruelty came from a place of such deep wounding that I could not see beyond my own pain to recognize yours." And then he told her about his mother in greater detail than he had ever shared before, about how she had been a celebrated beauty who had married his father purely for the title and the wealth, about how she had made no secret of her disdain for both husband and son, about how she had finally abandoned them both when Adrian was 7 years old, running away with a lover to the continent and leaving behind only a note that said she had never wanted to be a mother or a duchess, and that they should not attempt to find her. He spoke of the years that followed, of his father's descent into bitter cynicism, of the lessons he had absorbed about women and marriage and trust, of the walls he had built around his heart so high and thick that by the time he reached adulthood, he believed himself incapable of love and believed all women incapable of genuine feeling. And when Arabella's father's debts had come to light just before the wedding, it had seemed to confirm everything he had always believed, and so he had struck first before she could wound him the way his mother had wounded his father, never stopping to consider that in protecting himself, he was becoming the very monster his mother had been. Arabella listened to this confession with her hands still held in his, and when he finally fell silent, she reached out with one hand and touched his face gently, wiping away his tears with her thumb, and she told him about her own losses, about her mother's death when she was 12, about how her father had tried so hard to be both parents to her and had bankrupted himself in the process of ensuring she had the education and opportunities befitting a lady, about how she had discovered after his death that the debts everyone whispered about had been incurred not through gambling or profligacy, but through his desperate attempts to secure her future and through his generosity to others who needed help. And she admitted that she too had learned to guard her heart, to expect disappointment, and yet she had chosen to hope anyway on their wedding night, had chosen to believe that love might be possible, and when that hope had been crushed, she had felt as though something essential in her had died. They sat together in the firelight, sharing their griefs and their wounds, finding in each other's pain a mirror of their own suffering, and gradually they began to understand that they were not so different after all, that they had both been shaped by abandonment and loss, that they had both learned to survive by closing themselves off from the very connection they most desperately needed. And in that understanding, something new began to grow between them, something more solid than attraction and deeper than sympathy. A recognition that they stood on common ground at last, and that from this foundation they might build something true. The village fair arrived with the turning of autumn into its deeper phase, when the leaves had moved from gold to russet, and the air carried that peculiar crispness that spoke of approaching winter, and Arabella had planned to attend as she had the previous year, finding comfort in the simple pleasures of country life and the warmth of the villagers who had shown her such kindness during her exile. But this year was different because Adrian asked if he might escort her, his voice tentative as though he expected refusal, and she found herself agreeing after a long moment of internal deliberation, thinking that perhaps it was time to test the fragile understanding they had built in the firelit intimacy of the cottage against the scrutiny of the outside world. Their appearance together caused an immediate sensation that rippled through the fairgrounds like wind across wheat, heads turning and conversations stopping mid-sentence, as the Duke of Ashford walked beside his banished wife with a careful attentiveness that seemed to surprise everyone who witnessed it, and Adrian bore the stares and whispers with a dignity that was entirely new, making no attempt to intimidate or silence the gossips, but instead focusing all his attention on Arabella, asking what she would like to see first, whether she was warm enough, if she would care for some refreshment, and his solicitude so genuine that even the most skeptical observers found themselves reconsidering their assumptions about the cold Duke and his mysterious marriage. He won her a ribbon at the archery contest, his skill with a bow evident in the clean flight of his arrows toward the target, and when he presented the prize to her with a slight bow and a smile that transformed his usually stern features into something almost boyish. Arabella felt her breath catch in a way that had nothing to do with the autumn chill, and everything to do with the realization that she was seeing him as he might have been if life had been kinder to him, if his mother had not taught him that love was a weapon and trust a fool's currency, and she accepted the ribbon with a murmured thanks that did not quite hide the emotion in her voice. Later, he bought her hot cider from a vendor's stall, warming the cup between his hands before giving it to her, and they stood together watching the Morris dancers perform their intricate steps. And when one of the dancers invited audience members to join them, Adrian looked at Arabella with a question in his eyes, and she found herself nodding, laughing as he led her into the circle, with an awkward grace that spoke of his unfamiliarity with such common pleasures. And for those few minutes as they moved through the simple dance steps, surrounded by villagers and farmers and tradesmen, she forgot entirely about duchesses and dukes and society's expectations, and simply existed as a woman dancing with a man who was trying so very hard to earn her forgiveness. The moment of pure joy that followed was something she would remember long afterward. The way her laughter came freely and unguarded for the first time since their wedding night. The way Adrian's face lit up when he heard it, as though she had given him a gift beyond price. The way the autumn sun slanted through the trees and made everything seem touched with gold. And in that instant, she caught a glimpse of what their life might become if they could find the courage to truly begin again, not weighted down by the past but learning from it, not pretending the wounds had never existed, but acknowledging that even deep cuts could heal if properly tended. As evening approached and the fair began to wind down, they walked slowly back toward the cottage, neither quite ready for the day to end, and when they reached her gate, Adrian turned to her, and there was such longing in his expression, such careful hope, that Arabella knew he wanted to kiss her, and for a heartbeat she wanted it too, wanted to close the distance between them and discover if his lips might be as gentle as his recent actions suggested. But fear rose up to choke the impulse, before it could fully form, fear that if she gave herself to hope again, she would only be setting herself up for another devastating fall. And so she pulled back and whispered, "I'm not ready yet, Adrian. I'm sorry, but I'm just not ready." And though disappointment flickered across his features, he only nodded and said with quiet understanding, "I will wait as long as you need, Arabella. I will wait forever if that is what it takes." And she went inside alone while he returned to his room at the village inn, both of them carrying with them the memory of a day when happiness had seemed almost within reach, so close they could nearly taste it, yet still separated by the canyon of broken trust that only time and patience could bridge. The letter arrived on a grey morning 3 days after the fair, delivered by a rider from London who handed it to Mrs. Hewitt with an air of importance that immediately set Arabella's nerves on edge, and when she broke the seal and saw that it came from Lady Pemberton, a distant cousin who moved in the highest circles of society, her hands began to tremble even before she read the contents, and what she found written there in elegant script made her feel as though the floor had dropped away beneath her feet. For Lady Pemberton wrote, with the poisonous sweetness of false concern, to inform her that London society was ablaze with speculation about the Ashford marriage, that rumours were circulating about why the Duke had banished his bride, with some saying she must have been defective in some fundamental way to warrant such rejection, while others whispered that she had gone mad on her wedding night and had to be confined for her own safety, and still others suggested darker things about her character and her virtue, and though Lady Pemberton claimed to be writing out of familial duty to warn her, the barely concealed satisfaction in her prose made it clear that she was enjoying delivering this news of Arabella's social ruination. Adrian arrived at the cottage an hour later for their planned walk, and found Arabella sitting rigid in her chair by the window, the letter crumpled in her lap, her face pale and her eyes holding that same wounded look he remembered from their wedding night, and when he asked what was wrong, she simply handed him the letter without speaking, watching as his expression transformed from concern to fury as he read, his jaw clenching and his knuckles going white where he gripped the paper, and he began to pace the small parlour like a caged wolf, his voice rough with rage, as he cursed the gossip-mongers and their cruel tongues, swearing that he would make them retract every vicious word, that he would challenge anyone who dared speak ill of her, that he would see them all in hell before he let them destroy her reputation. But his anger, however well-intentioned, only made Arabella feel worse because it reminded her that she had no control over her own fate, that her worth and her name were subject to the whims of people who did not know her and did not care to know the truth. She felt all the old wounds reopening, all the shame and unworthiness that his banishment had carved into her soul, rising up fresh and raw, and she found herself retreating behind the walls she had so carefully begun to lower, her voice flat and distant as she said, "It does not matter what you say or do, Adrian. The damage is done, and perhaps they are right. Perhaps there is something fundamentally wrong with me that made you find me so easy to cast aside." And though he protested vehemently, dropping to his knees before her chair and trying to take her hands in his, she pulled away and turned her face toward the window, unable to bear the pity she imagined she saw in his eyes. Adrian's frustration was a palpable thing, filling the cottage with tension as he struggled to find words that might comfort her, that might undo the harm that distant strangers had inflicted with their careless cruelty. But everything he said seemed to fall short, his apologies sounding hollow even to his own ears, his assurances that she was perfect and blameless, ringing false against the weight of her pain. And after an hour of this, he finally fell silent, recognizing that in this moment there was nothing he could say that would reach her, and he left the cottage with his heart heavy and his mind already turning to what actions he might take to rectify this new wrong. Mrs. Hewitt found Arabella still sitting by the window as darkness fell, and the old housekeeper settled into the opposite chair with a sigh and said gently, "Trust takes time to rebuild, my lady, and setbacks are part of the journey, not the end of it." And Arabella turned to her with tears streaming down her face and whispered, "What if I can never truly trust again? What if I am too broken to be mended?" And Mrs. Hewitt reached across and took her hand and replied with the wisdom of long years, "Broken things can be mended, dear child, but the mending takes patience, and sometimes the cracks must ache a bit before they finally heal." 9. Adrian departed for London the following morning with a resolve that burned in his chest like fire, leaving Arabella a brief note that said only, "I will make this right." And though she felt numb and hollowed out by the previous day's revelations, she could not help but wonder what he intended to do, whether his anger would lead him to make matters worse, or whether he truly had some plan that might salvage what remained of her reputation. The journey to the capital took 2 days of hard riding, and Adrian spent every mile of it composing and discarding speeches in his mind, knowing that what he was about to do would expose him to ridicule and possibly damage his own standing in society, but finding that he no longer cared what the ton thought of him, that the only opinion that mattered was Arabella's, and he had already lost that through his own cruelty. So what further harm could come from telling the truth? He arrived in London on the evening of Lady Harrington's annual ball, the most significant social event of the autumn season, where every person of consequence would be gathered under one glittering roof, and he sent word ahead that the Duke of Ashford would be in attendance, knowing that his presence after months of absence would draw immediate attention and that the gossip about his marriage would be the first topic on everyone's lips. When he entered the ballroom that evening, the conversations did not merely pause but stopped entirely, hundreds of pairs of eyes turning toward him with barely concealed curiosity and speculation, and he could see in their expressions that they were already cataloguing his appearance for later dissection, already preparing their cutting remarks about the Duke whose bride had proven so unsatisfactory that he had been forced to hide her away, and he let them look their fill before he walked directly to the center of the room and requested the orchestra's silence, his voice carrying across the stunned assembly with an authority that commanded immediate obedience. What followed was a speech that would be repeated in drawing rooms and gentlemen's clubs for months afterward, as Adrian Blackwell, Duke of Ashford, stood before the cream of society and declared in clear, unwavering tones that the separation from his wife had been entirely his fault, that he had acted on unfounded suspicions and allowed the wounds of his past to poison his judgment, that Lady Arabella was a woman of impeccable character and extraordinary kindness, who had shown him more grace than he deserved, and that any rumors suggesting otherwise were not merely false but malicious lies that he would not tolerate. He praised her intelligence, her compassion, her dignity in the face of treatment that would have broken a lesser person, and he looked directly at Lady Pemberton as he said that anyone who spoke ill of his wife would answer to him personally, the implicit challenge in his words making several gentlemen shift uncomfortably and causing Lady Pemberton to pale and suddenly find her fan fascinating. The ballroom remained utterly silent when he finished, and then slowly, almost hesitantly, the Earl of Somerset began to applaud, and others joined him until the sound filled the space, and Adrian knew that while he had not erased all the damage, he had at least shifted the narrative, had made it clear that Arabella was under his protection and that her honor was his to defend. He left London the next day with a portfolio full of letters that had been delivered to his hotel, apology notes from society matrons who wished to make amends with the Duchess of Ashford, invitations for them both to various events, and obsequious messages from people who had been all too eager to spread rumors but were now desperate to distance themselves from the gossip. And as he rode back toward the cottage, he felt something he had not experienced in years, a sense that he had done something truly right, that he had used his power and position not to intimidate or control but to protect someone who deserved protecting. When he arrived at the cottage and placed the letters in Arabella's hands, watching as she read through them with wide eyes that slowly filled with tears, he said simply, "I told them the truth, that you are everything good and I was the fool who failed to see it." And she looked up at him with an expression he could not quite read, something between gratitude and wonder and the first tentative stirrings of belief. And she whispered, "You did this for me." And he replied, "I would do far more than this, Arabella. I would remake the entire world if it would take away even a fraction of the pain I have caused you." And in that moment, she began to believe that perhaps his transformation was real, that perhaps the man standing before her was truly different from the one who had sent her away into the cold and dark. And though she was not ready to forgive completely, she felt the ice around her heart beginning to crack. The first snow fell on the anniversary of their wedding, a year to the day since Adrian had sent Arabella into the darkness with words that had shattered both their lives. And when she woke that morning to find the world transformed into a landscape of white silence, she felt the weight of that symbolism settle over her like the snow itself, covering everything that had been with a blanket of new possibility. Adrian arrived at the cottage mid-morning with his arms full of evergreen branches and his cheeks flushed from the cold, and when she opened the door, he said simply, "I thought we might decorate together, if you would like. I remember you once mentioned that your mother used to fill your home with greenery at Christmas," and the fact that he had remembered such a small detail from one of their conversations made something warm bloom in her chest. Despite her attempts to guard her heart, they worked in companionable near silence, winding the branches around the mantelpiece and the doorways, and the cottage filled with the sharp, clean scent of pine and winter, and there was something deeply peaceful about this domestic collaboration, this shared creation of beauty in her small sanctuary, and Arabella found herself thinking that this was what marriage should have been from the beginning, this easy partnership and quiet understanding. As they paused for tea in the afternoon, sitting before the fire with snow falling steadily outside the windows, Adrian cleared his throat and said with careful hesitation, "Arabella, I have been thinking about what a real marriage might look like between us. Not the travesty I created, but something genuine and whole. And I wondered if you might be willing to discuss what that could mean." And she felt her pulse quicken, because this was the conversation she had been both dreading and longing for. The moment when they would have to decide whether to truly move forward or remain forever in this liminal space of almost reconciliation. She set down her teacup and looked at him directly, this man who had wounded her so deeply, but who had also proven himself capable of genuine transformation, and she said, "What are you asking, Adrian?" And he moved from his chair to kneel before her, not in supplication but in honesty, his eyes meeting hers as he replied, "I am asking if you would allow me to court you properly, and to earn your love, as I should have done from the beginning, to build something real between us, rather than the hollow arrangement our marriage has been. I want to start over, Arabella, not to erase what happened, because that would be impossible and dishonest, but to create something new from the ruins of what I destroyed." Her internal struggle was visible on her face, the war between fear and hope, between the safety of her walls and the terrifying vulnerability of letting them fall, and she thought about all the ways he had proven himself in recent months, his patience and his public defense of her honor, and his willingness to endure discomfort for her sake, but she also remembered the crushing pain of that wedding night, and the long months of exile, and the fear that he might one day decide she was not worth the effort after all. She took a deep breath and said, "If we do this, Adrian, there must be boundaries. I cannot simply surrender myself to you and hope that you will not break me again. I need to know that my voice will be heard, that my feelings will matter, that I am not just an object to be possessed, but a person to be partnered with." And he nodded immediately and said, "Whatever boundaries you need, whatever time you require, I will respect them all. You set the pace of this courtship, Arabella, and I will follow where you lead." She found herself saying yes before she had fully decided to, the word escaping her lips like a bird released from a cage, and she added quickly, "But slowly. Adrian, we must go slowly. I am not ready to trust completely, not yet." And he reached for her hand with a question in his eyes, and when she nodded permission, he raised it to his lips and kissed her knuckles with a reverence that made her breath catch, and he whispered, "Slowly, then, as slowly as you need, and I will ask permission for everything, every touch and every step forward, because your comfort and your healing matter more to me than my own desires." The weeks that followed Adrian's proposal of courtship unfolded with a gentleness that Arabella had never imagined possible, each day bringing small moments of connection that slowly but inexorably wound themselves around her heart, like the climbing roses that would soon bloom again in her cottage garden. Adrian arrived each morning with some thoughtful offering, never grand or ostentatious but always perfectly chosen to show that he had been paying attention to her words and her preferences, one day bringing a new volume of poetry by a writer she had mentioned admiring, another day arriving with seeds for her garden that he had procured from a botanist in the neighboring county, and on a particularly meaningful afternoon he presented her with a portrait of her mother that he had tracked down and purchased from a distant cousin who had acquired it after her father's estate was sold, and when Arabella saw her mother's gentle face looking back at her from the canvas, she wept openly, and Adrian simply stood beside her and let her cry without trying to fix or minimize her grief. They took long walks through the countryside as winter gradually loosened its grip, and the first hints of spring began to emerge in patches of snowdrops and the swelling of buds on bare branches. And during these walks they talked about everything and nothing, about books and philosophy and the nature of forgiveness, about childhood memories both sweet and painful, and about their hopes for what their life together might become if they could truly learn to trust one another. Arabella found herself opening like one of those spring flowers, carefully and gradually but unmistakably sharing pieces of herself that she had kept locked away during the long months of exile, and Adrian received each revelation with a reverence that made her feel seen and valued in ways she had never experienced. The crisis came on an afternoon in early March, when they had a disagreement about his insistence on increasing her allowance, a practical matter that should not have caused such turmoil, but which triggered something deep and primal in Arabella, the old fear that he saw her as someone who needed to be managed and controlled rather than partnered with, and she found herself lashing out with words sharper than she intended, accusing him of trying to buy her affection and manipulate her into gratitude. She watched his face carefully as she spoke, bracing herself for the anger and withdrawal she expected, the Duke of Ashford emerging to put her in her place and remind her of all the ways she was dependent on his generosity. But instead, Adrian simply stood very still and listened until she had exhausted her fury, and then he said quietly, "You are right. I handled that poorly. I should have discussed it with you, rather than simply deciding. And I am sorry that I made you feel as though your opinion did not matter." And the fact that he did not defend himself or retreat into cold formality, but instead acknowledged his mistake and apologized with genuine humility made Arabella realize with startling clarity that he had truly changed, that the man before her was not the same person who had sent her away, and she felt something shift fundamentally in her heart. That evening, as they sat together in the cottage parlor, she reached for his hand, the first time she had initiated physical contact between them, and she said with a voice that trembled only slightly, "I am falling in love with you, Adrian, with the man you have become, and that terrifies me because I do not know if I can survive being broken again. But I also know that I do not want to live the rest of my life behind walls. So I am choosing to be brave. I am choosing to believe that what we are building together is real and lasting." And Adrian brought her hand to his lips and kissed it with a tenderness that made her breath catch, and he whispered, "Then I will spend every day proving that your bravery is not misplaced, that your trust is not a mistake, that you are loved completely and unconditionally for exactly who you are." Spring arrived with an abundance that felt almost excessive in its beauty, as though nature itself was celebrating the transformation that had taken place over the long winter months. And when Arabella woke one morning to find the cottage garden suddenly alive, with daffodils and the trees wearing delicate coronets of new leaves, she felt that the world was offering her a visible symbol of renewal and rebirth. And perhaps that was why, when Adrian arrived that afternoon and asked if they might take a walk to the old stone bridge that crossed the stream at the edge of the property, she agreed without hesitation, sensing that something significant was about to unfold between them. They walked in comfortable silence for a time, their shoulders occasionally brushing as they navigated the narrow path, and Arabella was acutely aware of how natural this felt now, how the awkwardness and tension that had characterized their early interactions had given way to an ease that she had never thought possible. And when they reached the bridge, Adrian stopped and turned to face her with an expression of such vulnerability and hope that her breath caught in her throat. He took both her hands in his, a liberty she had granted him only recently, and he said with a voice that trembled slightly, "Arabella, I have a question to ask you, and I need you to answer honestly, even if that honesty causes me pain, because I would rather know the truth than live in false hope." And she nodded for him to continue, her heart beginning to race, because she thought she knew what he was about to ask, and she was not certain she was ready to give the answer he sought. Adrian drew a deep breath and said, "Will you return to Ashford Manor with me? Not as the banished wife I created in my cruelty, but as my true duchess and partner. As the woman I love and wish to build a real life with, I am asking you to trust me enough to leave this sanctuary you have created and come back to the place where I hurt you so deeply, and I know that is an enormous thing to ask." And Arabella felt her stomach tighten with sudden anxiety, because the cottage had become her refuge and her safety, and the thought of returning to those grand cold rooms where she had experienced such rejection made something inside her recoil instinctively. She pulled her hands from his and walked a few steps away, her mind racing through all the reasons why this was too much too soon, why she could not possibly trust those walls that had witnessed her humiliation, and she said with her back still to him, "I do not know if I can do that, Adrian. This cottage is where I learned to survive without you, where I built a life from the ruins you left me with, and Ashford Manor represents everything that broke in me. How can you ask me to go back there?" She heard him move closer, but he did not touch her, respecting the distance she had put between them, and he said quietly, "Then we will not. We will make the cottage our primary home. I will move my life here rather than asking you to return to a place that holds such painful memories. Arabella, I do not need the grandeur of Ashford Manor. I do not need the vast rooms and the servants and the appearance of ducal authority. All I need is to be wherever you are, and if that is this small cottage, then I will count myself the richest man in England." She turned to look at him and saw in his face complete sincerity. This powerful duke, who commanded respect and fear throughout the county, offering to abandon everything for her comfort. And she realized that this was the final proof she had been waiting for without knowing it, the ultimate demonstration that she mattered more to him than pride or position or the opinions of society. And she felt the last of her protective walls crumble and fall away like the winter snow melting before the spring Sunday. She walked back to him and placed her hands on his chest, feeling his heart beating rapidly beneath her palms, and she said with a clarity that surprised her, "I choose to believe in us, Adrian. I choose to trust that what we have built together is strong enough to withstand even the ghosts of Ashford Manor. So yes, I will return with you. Not because you have proven yourself worthy through suffering, though you have done that, but because I genuinely believe that we can create something beautiful together, something that honors both the pain we have survived and the love we have discovered." The journey back to Ashford Manor took place on a morning when the world seemed suspended between winter's end and spring's true beginning, and as the carriage rolled through the iron gates that Arabella had last seen on that terrible wedding night over a year ago, she felt Adrian's hand close around hers with a gentle pressure that seemed to say without words that he understood her trepidation and would not let her face this homecoming alone. The staff had assembled in the grand entrance hall just as they had done for her arrival as a bride, but this time there was no coldness in their faces, no uncomfortable uncertainty about how to treat the banished duchess. Instead, Thornbury stepped forward with what might have been the first genuine smile Arabella had ever seen on his usually impassive face, and he said with quiet dignity, "Welcome home, Your Grace. We are honored to have you return to us." And the other servants echoed his sentiment with warm murmurs of greeting that brought unexpected tears to Arabella's eyes. Adrian led her up the sweeping staircase to the chambers that had been designated as hers during that brief, terrible night. But when he opened the door, she gasped, because the room had been completely transformed. The heavy dark furnishings that had made it feel like a mausoleum, replaced with lighter pieces in warm woods, the oppressive burgundy draperies exchanged for curtains in soft cream that allowed the spring sunlight to flood the space. And everywhere she looked, she saw evidence of Adrian's attention to her preferences, the small writing desk positioned by the window where she could look out over the gardens, the bookshelf already filled with volumes he knew she loved, the portrait of her mother given pride of place above the fireplace, and most touching of all, a vase of daffodils on the bedside table with a note in Adrian's hand that read simply, "For new beginnings." She turned to him with tears streaming down her face and said, "You did all this for me," and he replied with a voice thick with emotion, "I wanted you to know from the moment you entered these rooms that they are yours in truth, that you are not a guest or an interloper, but the mistress of this house and the keeper of my heart. And if anything here displeases you, we will change it immediately, because your comfort and happiness matter more to me than any tradition or expectation." The days that followed were filled with small acts of reclamation as Arabella gradually made Ashford Manor feel like a home rather than a prison, and Adrian was constantly at her side, supporting her efforts and deferring to her judgment in all matters of household management, making it clear to everyone that the Duchess of Ashford was not merely decorative but a true partner in all things. When they hosted a dinner for the villagers who had shown Arabella kindness during her exile, inviting humble farmers and shopkeepers to dine in the grand hall where normally only nobility would sit, Adrian rose at the end of the meal and said to the assembled guests, "I asked you here tonight because I wanted to publicly acknowledge and thank those of you who showed my wife compassion and friendship when I had failed her so completely. You treated her with the respect and dignity that I, in my arrogance and fear, denied her, and I am deeply grateful for the kindness you extended to her during the darkest period of both our lives." And his words moved many of the guests to tears, and established beyond doubt that things at Ashford Manor had fundamentally changed. The most sacred moment came on a quiet evening 2 weeks after their return, when Adrian asked Arabella to meet him in the small private chapel that stood in the manor's oldest wing, and when she arrived she found it lit with hundreds of candles and the elderly vicar from the village waiting with a gentle smile. And Adrian took both her hands and said, "Our first wedding was a mockery of everything marriage should be. I spoke vows I did not mean and made promises I immediately broke, so I wanted to ask if you would renew those vows with me now, not before a crowd of society observers, but here in this quiet place with only God and this good man as witnesses, and this time when I promise to love and cherish you, it will be the absolute truth of my heart." And Arabella felt such overwhelming love for this man, who had hurt her so deeply, and then worked so patiently to heal the wounds he had caused, that she could barely speak. But she managed to whisper, "Yes, I will marry you again. I will bind my life to yours with full knowledge and full heart." And when they spoke their vows this time, there was no hesitation or reservation, only two people who had walked through fire and emerged, transformed, choosing deliberately and consciously to build a life together, founded on trust and genuine affection rather than duty and arrangement. 5 years had passed since that spring day when Arabella chose to believe in the possibility of redemption, and now as she sat at the breakfast table in Ashford Manor's sun-filled morning room, watching Adrian help their 4-year-old daughter, Catherine, cut her toast into precise squares, while their infant son, James, gurgled contentedly in his cradle nearby, she felt a profound sense of gratitude for the circuitous path that had brought them to this moment of ordinary domestic happiness. The kind of happiness that would have seemed impossible during those dark months in the cottage when she had believed herself permanently exiled from love and belonging. Adrian looked up from his task and caught her eye with a smile that still had the power to make her heart quicken, and she thought how remarkable it was that this man, who had once been so imprisoned by fear and pride, had become the most devoted father and husband she could have imagined. patient with the children's endless questions and never too important or busy to participate in the small rituals of family life that gave their days structure and meaning. The estate itself had been transformed under their joint stewardship into a place known throughout the county, not for the Duke's fearsome reputation, but for the compassion and justice with which he and his Duchess treated everyone, from the highest nobleman to the humblest tenant farmer. And Arabella had established a school in the village where children of all stations could learn to read and cipher, funded by a portion of the estate's income that Adrian had insisted be set aside for charitable purposes, because he said he wanted their children to grow up understanding that privilege carried responsibility. They still spent time at the cottage, which they had expanded slightly but kept deliberately simple, and those retreats to the place where their true marriage had begun remained sacred to both of them, a reminder that love built in hardship and tested by time was stronger than any grand gesture or elaborate display. Arabella thought often about that terrified 19-year-old girl who had been sent away on her wedding night, and while she would never say she was grateful for that suffering, she had come to understand that it had been necessary somehow, that both she and Adrian had needed to be broken down to their essential selves before they could build something authentic together, and she knew with absolute certainty that the easy affection of an arranged marriage that had never faced crisis could not have produced the depth of understanding and commitment they now shared. Adrian reached across the table to take her hand, a gesture he made dozens of times each day, as though he still could not quite believe she was real and present and his, and he said quietly, "What are you thinking about with such a serious expression?" And she replied with complete honesty, "I was thinking about how grateful I am for second chances, for the courage it takes to trust again after being hurt, and for the patience we both learned during those long months of healing." And he brought her hand to his lips and kissed it gently and said, "Every day I wake up knowing I do not deserve the gift you have given me in choosing to forgive and love me, and every day I am determined to prove myself worthy of that choice." Dear listener, if you have stayed with this story through all its sorrows and transformations, perhaps you have recognized in Arabella and Adrian's journey something of your own struggles with trust and vulnerability, for we all carry wounds from times when we were not treated with the care we deserved, and we all face the question of whether we can risk opening our hearts again after they have been broken. The truth this story offers is not that love conquers all, or that time heals all wounds, but rather that genuine transformation is possible when two people are willing to do the difficult work of honest communication and patient understanding, when they choose daily to honor their commitment, even when it would be easier to retreat into self-protection or pride. Love requires courage. The courage to be vulnerable when every instinct screams for you to build walls, the courage to forgive without forgetting, but also without using past pain as a weapon, the courage to believe that people can change even when you have evidence of their capacity to hurt you. But love also requires patience, the patience to allow healing to unfold at its own pace rather than demanding immediate restoration, the patience to recognize that trust must be rebuilt through accumulated small actions rather than grand gestures, the patience to sit with discomfort and uncertainty while waiting to see if the transformation you hope for will prove real and lasting. If you are in a season of heartbreak or disappointment, if someone you trusted has failed you, or if you have failed someone you love, know that redemption is not impossible, though it is also not inevitable. It must be earned through genuine change and chosen through deliberate grace, and both parties must be willing to meet in that difficult middle ground where accountability and compassion exist together. May you find the wisdom to know which relationships are worth fighting for and which must be released. May you have the strength to do the hard work of transformation, whether that means changing yourself or setting boundaries that protect your heart, and may you discover that even the most broken things can sometimes be mended into something more beautiful than they were before. Rest well, dear listener, and know that your story is still being written. If you enjoyed this tale of redemption and second chances, please consider subscribing to Enchanted Quill Chronicles for more stories of love, transformation, and the resilience of the human heart.